Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies, thank you for joining us online for the second lecture in our colloquium series. Now, before we begin, I would like to briefly highlight some upcoming in-person events. On November 20th, we'll host Johan Elveskog, professor at Southern Methodist University, for a talk on Uyghur Buddhism. This spring, from April 29th to May 1st, we are organizing a conference and workshop tentatively titled On and Beyond Gandhara. And next fall, from October 8th to 10th, a very exciting program, we think, we will hold a conference on Tang music, Tang Dynasty music, past and present. Which will also feature academic sessions along with music and dance performances. So please check our website in early spring for further details. Now, a quick note about today's format. If you encounter any technical issues, please use the chat function to alert us to those. And for questions and comments related to the lecture, use the Q&A box. And we'll address as many as we can after the talk. All right, so it's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lanlan Kuang, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Central Florida. Now, Dr. Kuang received a Ph.D. in folklore and ethnomusicology from Indiana University, Bloomington, and was a Fulbright Scholar in 2008 and 2009. Her research brings together Asian arts and humanities, aesthetics, museum and heritage studies, and cultural policy with a focus on how cultural expression is shaped and transformed by social and political environments. She approaches these questions both as a scholar and as a storyteller, and has been publishing and producing ethnographic work since the mid-1990s. Dr. Kuang is the author of two major monographs on Dunhuang expressive arts. Her first book, Dunhuang Performing Arts, The Construction and Transmission of Chinascape in the Global Context, was published by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Her most recent book, Staging Tianxia, Dunhuang Expressive Arts and China's Cosmopolitan New Heritage, was recently published by Indiana University Press, 2024. The latter work explores how Dunhuang performance traditions contribute to global heritage and shared artistic imagination. In addition to her scholarship, Dr. Kuang serves on the Florida Folklife Council and on several editorial boards. She's a distinguished fellow of the Center for Ethnic and Folk Literature and Art Development and has held visiting appointments at the Dunhuang Academy, Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, the Bogazici University, and I take it that's in Turkey.
You're correct. Thank you.
Yes. So before handing her the microphone, I also just want to alert you to the fact that we are going to toggle between video and the PowerPoint presentation. So we think there won't be any hiccups, but if there are any hiccups, I would like to ask the audience to please be generous while we figure this out. So with that said, welcome, Dr. Lanlan Kuang.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yes. Hello, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening. Greetings from Orlando, Florida. It is my great honor and pleasure to present as a speaker at the very prestigious center at UC Berkeley today. And I would like to start by thanking, obviously, the chair, Dr. Sanjyot Mehendale, and Dr. Frank Berkeley, and the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies for the invitation and thoughtful arrangements. As the audience must already know, both of them are leading scholars in the highly cross-disciplinary field of Silk Road studies. And I am very grateful for this opportunity to share my recent research on Silk Road and the Dunhuang Expressive Arts. And we will learn a little bit more about the definition of the expressive art per se, in versus to the normally when you hear Dunhuang arts. I also make distinguish of the traditional general term referring to the Dunhuang arts versus the Dunhuang expressive arts. So, and if I understand correctly, this event is open to the Berkeley community and live streaming and recording for public viewing. And for this reason, my lecture today will be for both general audience who might need some background information and more in-depth discussion, perhaps some theories for students of Asian arts studies in general, and Dunhuangology or Silk Road studies, who might be looking for the more detailed examples and contents. The first part of today's lecture will introduce briefly my fieldwork in Dunhuang and UNESCO World Heritage Sites key role as one of the most important, if not the most important, considered by many scholars, frontier metropolis on the Silk Road past and in present-day China as well. And I will then introduce a few key concepts in the chapters of my 2024 monograph, Staging Tianxia. And some of the examples or discussions might seem irrelevant at the beginning. I will try to do my best to show you some of the not so apparent connections and to ensure that my lecture and on time, hopefully it will, as the subject matter draws on many references, and we will also be watching video clips after the initial introduction, where I probably will talk a little bit more freely. I will at times be reading from the notes that I have prepared. So thank you for your patience. So I am currently an associate professor in the philosophy department at the University of Central Florida, located in Orlando, Florida. And this week, and especially today actually, is the so-called Space Week at UCF, at our university, which is a space grant university focusing on aerospace engineering works, closely working with NASA, students and faculties both. And many of my students are of STEM background and major in related fields. Interestingly, one of the most iconic image associated with the Dunhuang arts, and especially the Dunhuang expressive arts, is the flying apsara, as you can see on your right, on my left, that is from cave 285. And I'm sure many of you would have referring to the Dunhuang deities in the Dunhuang murals. This is just one of many flying apsaras that you find in Dunhuang murals. And in Staging Tianxia, I discuss a few examples as a case study of how the flying apsaras inspire modern to contemporary Chinese artists to stage numerous expressive arts in various forms. These artists, including, of course, the founding director of the Dunhuang Academy, and also Zhang Daqian, the artist, and of course, in the field of the performing arts, Grandmaster Lanlan Kuang, those of you who know him from listening to Peking opera, he's very well-known Chinese Peking opera Grandmaster, and also Professor Gao Jinrong. She is a famous choreographer whom I have the honor and pleasure to study and also conduct fieldwork with in the last 2 decades or perhaps longer. So 2 decades in the field does not only mean that I have aged significantly, obviously, since I first visited Dunhuang in 2000, I believe, if not earlier. It also provides the invaluable opportunity for me to witness, experience, and participate in the development of the Dunhuang expressive arts firsthand. My experience invites constant reflection each time I re-engage with the subject and also with the personnels and scholars that I interact with. Whereas technology, back to space you, or in a philosophical sense, technique, has always been a part of our concern when doing research on the arts. I also include a few examples of how the Dunhuang Expressive arts have been changing over time with the development of technology, as science and technology have never been far from our appreciation of beauty and our understanding of the world and the cosmos. And on the very right-hand side, those of you who play games online would probably know Honor of Kings, and this is one of the flying Apsara characters developed by Tang, the company, in association with the Dunhuang Academy. So as you can see, it's well implemented. And in fact, there's another example of practicing the Dunhuang dance, especially the flying Apsara in zero gravity in chamber. And so that all comes together as examples that you could associate with the Dunhuang art inspired research, not only focusing on the art research, but also in association to development in the scientific field. And of course, our human aspiration and wonders about the cosmos, about the world and the worldview start since the ancient time, not only now, right? And this is one of the oldest existing star chart dating to possibly the Tang dynasty, and that is discovered from the famous Dunhuang Library Cave. This is only a portion of the longer scroll, and so each part of the scroll actually shows you the different constellations and etc. And in the early 20th century, those of you who don't know about the library cave, a Taoist priest named Wang Yuanlu was working to restore the Mogao caves, a Buddhist cave, we will see in a minute, complex near Dunhuang. In this process, he discovered a secret cave that has been sealed for almost 1,000 years. Named the Library Cave, it contains around 40,000 manuscripts, paintings, and print documents on silk and paper. So this is among the many treasures that they found, so all the archaeologists would know about this. And among them was this beautiful illustrated manuscript containing the oldest star atlas known today from any civilizations, probably dating from around 700 CE. And it contains 13 star charts and over 13,000 bright and faint stars visible to the naked eye from north central China. So this discovery, not only the star atlas star chart, but the discovery of the library cave itself is so important and significant that, please allow me to switch screen. I opened the first paragraph of Staging Tianxia describing the opening scenes of A Grand Dream of Dunhuang, 大梦 Dunhuang, which is an award-winning dance drama staged in various places around the globe since its first stage in China. If you are interested in exploring further, you can go to the International Dunhuang Program. Under the Chinese sky, they have the star charts available for you to explore. So something that might be interest of you. But back to our subject, this is the opening page of my book, which you can find easily. Please allow me to just read a few paragraphs from the page. It was a winter night in New York City. Lights at the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts were shining brightly. The performance hall in the David Court Theater was filled gradually by the howling of the desert wind, creating the oroscape of a dry, desolate land far from the metropolis. It was January 2020, 120 years since the discovery of the Dunhuang Library Cave, one of the 7 135 numbered grottos later excavated at Mogao along the 1.6 kilometers of cliff face above the Daquan River. Located near the oasis city of Dunhuang on the edge of the Gobi Desert in northwest China. These caves are collectively known as the Dunhuang Mogao Grottos. And then the curtain rose. Right, so the description is obviously longer in the book. But the scenes that I just described through the lens of and as a musicologist attempt to locate the audience at the Mogao Grottos in the rock sanctuaries that have long served as temples, sites for performative events even today during folk holidays and other occasions. They still serve similar purposes to a certain extent, of course, and archives of artifacts reflecting centuries of multicultural dialogue along the Silk Road. So the Silk Road, this is a talk for the Silk Road Center, and obviously the Silk Road inspired the idea of somewhere that is distant, that is far beyond the norm of the boundary that we know. In a way, there's a connection, there is a definition of boundary, but there's also a way, a role, or a journey. And in my other writings, I also explore the theme about Silk Road being a symbolic metaphor for journeying abroad from China to a certain extent. And again, the idea of embarking on a journey, be an intellectual one, a diplomatic one, as we see in this scenery, also from the Mogao caves, or one that is in the form of social political exile, especially one that ventures into the unknown and the unfamiliar frontier, is inseparable from forming and understanding one's worldview. More than 2,000 years ago, between 206 BCE to 220 CE, Zhang Qian, a celebrated diplomat sent by the Han imperial court, helped establish the Silk Road, a network of trade routes that link China to Central Asia, Europe, and the Arab world that influenced the development of connected regions for hundreds of years and arguably continues today. By 711, during China's Golden Tang Dynasty, China's western region became a true cultural hub, which mended different cultural systems, including Han of the Central Plain, Greek, India, Central Asia, and West Asia, before transmitting them elsewhere. And the arts from China, Northwest region, and especially Dunhuang, reveals an aesthetics ideal that exhibits the country's multi-ethnic and multifaceted cosmopolitan past, but also project a possible future. So in this particular mural, you do see supposedly the embrace traveling beyond there is the seal representing sort of the borderland, the mark, the stone mark beyond the empires, the land. So, and there are followers that is seeing him off, and etc. So this is also a very famous painting that has a mural that has appeared in many different occasions. But this is the outside of this is cave number 17, aka the library cave, which we just discovered. And this is part of the large complex commonly known as the Daisy Buddha caves, Jianfodong. The caves at the Mogao Cliff near the modern town of Dunhuang have served as temples, as I mentioned before, and sites for other performative events, and archive of medieval Chinese painting and Buddhist sutra. Among the 735 caves, there are 492 caves with murals, and murals area is about 45,000 square meter. So historically a frontier metropolis, Dunhuang is located at the western end of Hexi Corridor in China's northwest region. The scenic name of the geographic location of Dunhuang first appeared in the collective biography of Dayuan by Sima Qian around 145 to 86 BCE in the Shiji, which document the diplomatic mission of Zhang Qian, twice dispatched by the Han Emperor Wudi to the Western region, the so-called Grand Western region, between 139 to 125 BCE. So this mission played an important role, obviously, in the opening, according to Chinese historical records, of the Silk Road, which linked the Mediterranean coast with central China and beyond via the oasis towns such as Samarkand. And obviously, historians will also argue that the Silk Road, with the name, we all understand now the idea of Silk Road contains many different routes, including Frank Bill's writes about the maritime Silk Road, obviously. But here we are talking mainly about the land route. But the travelers, especially the Buddhist monks from India and Central Asia, passed through Dunhuang on their way to Chang'an, which is present-day Xi'an, China's ancient capital, would stop to meditate in the Mogao caves and consult manuscript and sometimes perhaps do translations in the monastery's library. And at the same time, Chinese pilgrims would travel by foot from China through Central Asia to Pakistan, India, Nepal. Obviously, the names would be different at the time, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, playing a key role in exchange between ancient China and the outside world. So as you can see, that Silk Road has this significance of signifying something that is beyond the border, but also linking something that is the familiar with the foreign. So travelers from China would stop to acquire provisions at Dunhuang before crossing the Gobi Desert to continue on their long journey abroad. So Dunhuang became a strategic site along the Silk Road in northwest China, a crossroad of trade and a locus for religious, cultural, and intellectual influence since possibly earlier than the Han, but we're looking at since the Han dynasty. So Dunhuang came to the modern world's attention when a large number of manuscripts, obviously the library cave, right? Around 14th, 11th century that discovered there and became like a time capsule of the Silk Road. It's referred to as a time capsule of the Silk Road. So the allure of Dunhuang has prompted scholars from around the world to cultivate new expertise in Asian studies, and their efforts have afforded us insights not only into the past, but as for today's topic, I will get into it, but also into the disciplinary practice of modern scholarship and artistic creations. Here is a little bit. The more popular photo that you will see is probably with stacks of documents, but photographers in a later time will discover there has been the possibility of modifying the photo, so I'm not using that one to show you. So within the, so back to the creation based on the historical materials. And we know that Dunhuang is also significant in modern China. It is one of the first UNESCO World Heritage Site listed in 1980s in China. And it is a frontier metropolis and a locus of religious and intellectual influence on the Silk Road. The Dunhuang Expressive Arts features the Dunhuang bihua yuewu, a rich and multifaceted genre of music and dance performances created in the 20th century, based primarily on the excavations not only from Dunhuang, but also from the surrounding archaeological sites and materials along the Silk Road, reaching, but primarily from Dunhuang. But the source of the genre would primarily be images, narratives, and musical tunes depicted in the wall painting and or documented discovered in the Dunhuang grottos, including notations, not only musical scores, but also there are dance notations. The genre tends to draw mainly from the artistic creation from the Sui and Tang dynasties. We will look at some of them later. Although artistic patterns established earlier, beginning in the Han Dynasty, also were evident, as are folkloric motifs, not only the religious Buddhist art motifs from contemporary popular narratives and vernacular literatures with non-religious themes. And you will see that in many of the stage performance in a sort of a story narrative form. And the genre has been thriving since the dance drama Ring of Flowers along the Silk Road, 丝路花语. Many of you will have heard of it or even seen it in theater, which earned international fame in the late 1970s, which is also a critical time when China is sort of reopening its and reconnecting with rest of the world. So within the contemporary context of global interdependencies, performative art have been used as strategic device for social mobilization and the representation and performance of modern national histories. In highlighting the Dunhuang bihua yuewu genre, my 2024 monograph, Staging Tianxia, presents the first major English language study of the staging processes of Dunhuang arts as a phenomenon, performative, of what I call a stage Chinascape, 中国景观, fluid and open conceptual landscape that emerge from the recently revived concept of Tianxia, which means literary or under heaven. It is an ancient Chinese vision of world order, repurposed by some scholars to become China's new cosmopolitan heritage. And by recently revived, I hint at the classical root of the Tianxia concept, which can be traced to China's Shang and Zhou dynasties, and which became an sort of a root idea in Confucius ethic as well as Taoist teaching. So in my book, you will see me quoting from both Confucius as well as Taoist classics. The introduction and chapter 2 in this book introduce this ancient concept, and the Tianxia system also proposed by modern contemporary scholars, Zhao Tingyang, in 2005, reflecting his interpretation of select classical canons and including a survey of scholarship, both supporting and challenging this modern system by Chinese, more and more Chinese scholars, actually. Since the publication of my 2016 book, Tianxia, the scholarship on Tianxia as sort of a revival idea in connection to be seen as alternative way of perceiving the world has become more prominent in the scholarly rhetoric. Nonetheless, while the use of Tianxia explain certain social, cultural, and political economical phenomenon in contemporary China, as proposed by modern scholars, as well as discussed in my book. As in the work of Zhao Tingyang and other scholars, I have also come to realize that during the course of my research for this book, that Tianxia's ancient or classical origin could be a double-edged sword. Its origin in the Chinese classics indeed implies that it emerged from a rich indigenous past, and I use Tianxia in the book's title for this exact reason, which is to highlight the continuous efforts of the ancient on the country's present, employing the term Chinascape, which is the focus of my 2016 book, might help scholars and policymakers and general readers understand that Tianxia may not always be the most appropriate approach even though it's very appealing, for reading modern and contemporary Chinese political philosophy and administrative style. I will talk a little bit more about Tianxia towards the later part of today's presentation, if we have time. And those are the two also very well-known murals come from Cave 156. They are also prominent in depicting the historical, political historical events that took place in the region now considered to be Dunhuang. So I discuss more in my book. So I'm going to move on and talk about music and dance now. So lovely, beautiful piece of artwork depicting on the southern wall of Cave 85. This is an interesting cave, which also has been collaboratively preserved. Once again, the involvement of modern science and technology in the process of trying to conserve and preserve murals, such as old as dating back to late Tang Dynasty. The Getty Institute and the Dunhuang Academy has collaborated to work on specific caves, and this is 85 is one of them. Now, the Dunhuang Expressive arts featuring the Dunhuang bihua yuewu, as I introduced before, a rich and multifaceted genre of music and dance performance created in the 20th century and based primarily on excavations near Dunhuang. The term Dunhuang bihua yuewu is a singular now referring to an expressive art genre. Literally means Dunhuang mural, music, and dance. It is also used as an adjective to describe individual programs that may be categorized within the genre. Some of the examples discussed in my book employ staging features other than music and dance inspired by the Dunhuang artifact, such as theories and techniques for creating theatrical and film productions. In this case, I have decided to use stage Dunhuang arts instead of just Dunhuang bihua yuewu. And in contrast, Dunhuang arts, which is a more popular and more general term, is often used by scholars for discussing paintings, murals, and other static, non-performative arts. So I have abided by scholarly tradition and use both Dunhuang arts when referring to such static objects. And now I would like to direct your attention to my personal blog for a minute to show you some of the examples. But in this particular case, you can already see that this is one of the painting Boolean preserved. The color is extremely elegant in a way, and also consider the details of the dance movements that you will see in contemporary staging of the Dunhuang mural dance and music. Scholars also put a lot of emphasis on studying on, in addition to the costume, which is also a major discipline in studying the performative aspect of Dunhuang arts associating with the performance like this one, as well as the recreation of the musical instruments on the side, as well as structure of the seating and the location and the spatial arrangement of the musicians and dancers within the larger piece of painting, larger piece of murals on the wall. So we will come back to look at this a little bit after I show you. I am probably short on time, but let's see how it goes. So this is, if you go to my website, what you can find here. By clicking on the, by the way, this is a map also showing you the various sites that would have been either part of my fieldwork sites or have significant inference materials and transmissions that have impact in relation to the staging process of the Dunhuang performative art, expressive art. So you're welcome to explore that on your own. But I do want to show you some of the materials that you can find here. Here is inside of one of the caves that is being preserved under the process of being preserved. This is on the northern cliff. Normally, you find the majority of the murals on the southern cliff. The northern cliff is many of them consist of cave without decorations, where the artists or the monks, they'll probably use them as the living space. Here is an exterior of the modern day conservation and preservation of the site, where you can see if you are spend amount of time there. And interestingly, I also pay attention to the sort of upkeep of the nowadays. When you look at the Dunhuang as a cultural site, you also perceive it not only as an archaeological site, but also as one of China's most famous tourist site. And it is also one of the most well-kept tourist site, I would say. So I also would have discussed a portion of how that would have played into the general meaning of staging the Dunhuang expressive art as well. And here is, as I mentioned before, when we look at the performative and expressive arts, we are not only looking at the staging processes from the choreographer or the musician's point of view, but also how the modern technology coming from an ethnographic film and documentary. There are huge difference in terms of just documentary versus the ethnographic. But in this case, this is a director from Beijing that is making a short focus, a thematic production that is on the Dunhuang dance. Now that Dunhuang dance has become one of the major discipline, dance genre, that is being taught in dance schools, especially in Northwest universities. You will also find teaching of the Dunhuang dance in Beijing Dance Academy, and etc. So that I discuss all those details in my book. And you can find that is under the section where I talk about the institutionalization of the dance genre. Here are, and then of course the beautiful, this is considered one of the most well-known image, often called the Mona Lisa of the East and comparably. But this is also particularly interesting is because of the very feminine gesture, as well as not only the foil golden painting technique that is putting on the luxurious decoration on the painting itself, but mural on itself, but also the image of the changing facial features, and all these would have association on inspiring how modern dancers would have imagined the expression, the facial expressions of the dancers that as they depict in the paintings, in the murals. So if you talk to choreographers, for instance, Professor Gao Jinrong, that I have also the late Professor Dong Xijiu, who is one of the most well-known and dance scholars from China Arts Academy in Beijing. She wrote historic Chinese dance histories. And so there's the draws comparison about how the Tang imagination of a feminine, like a female, whereas we don't know necessarily the actual gender, but there is the tendency of drawing on this very elegant, very soft expression in delivering this expression, associating in the idea of being modest as well as compassionate and etc. and beautiful, obviously, right? So those are this is actually one of my Fulbright fieldwork photos where I had the help from local film and radio stations in starting to recording, you can see the development, the curriculum of the dance genre since when I first began to study and follow the choreographers and dancers, and as well as performance, has developed into how advanced they have been in the past 20 years. So those are some of the things that you will be able to find, but most importantly, because I think we will run out of time, what I want to point out to you are the interactive graphics that also helps you to understand some of the theories behind my discussion about Chinascape, as well as the institutional worldviews and Tianxia, and how they play with what I call the Dunhuang meta system. So I think I have
Lanlan,
run out of time. So let me move on.
No, it's just I'm sorry to interrupt, but your papers are interfering with the microphone somehow. So there's a lot of static. So I'm just wondering whether you could find a way not to have them near the computer. I'm so sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, it's all fine. It's just
that's very noisy.
There's a little interference, yeah, and I think it's because of the papers.
It is. I am laying it on top of my laptop. So.
Yes.
I apologize. Now, so enough of me talking, actually. I think it's time for us to turn to something that is more interesting than just textual materials and static imagery. We want to look at some dances, obviously, right? So let's move back to, but before, let me actually, before I switch back, let us watch. I only have, 10 minutes, I believe. Is it correct? I have 10 minutes. Hello. Oh. Okay. So I'm sure many of you would have seen this before. So let me move back to. I forgot this. Okay. So. Obviously, you have seen the Thousand Hands and Thousand Eyes of Avalokiteshvara, and this is one of the most famous stage performance since it's made its sort of become really famous at the Paralympic in Athens, Greece, because also the group of performers that the dancers are disabled, mute, and deaf. So that adds on a different layers of meaning. So this is sort of one of the earlier forms of programs of the stage Dunhuang performances. But in addition, and you can obviously see that the choreographers would draw inspiration from the images of Thousand Hands and Thousand Eyes, Trivada, but also elevating due to the fact that the dance troupe is mute and that the idea of hearing the crying, seeing the sorrows, seeing the suffering, and hearing the crying of the unfortunate, and extending the hand of saving and helping. Right. So the layer of adding to the religious component of the element of the original religious art painting, adding on top of in sort of a humane world, give it a different layers of intertextual meanings, in addition to the fact that it's first stage representing China on a world stage, but obviously later on become a very popular program that has been touring around the globe. Perhaps less popular, not as popular as the dance itself are the pipa performance, pipa music performances. But nonetheless, more and more programs are being staged around the globe now. This is one of the Dunhuang pipa scores that is also discovered and decoded and reconstructed in a way. I do want to point the audience to the wonderful decoded performances of. Let me see. Not this one. So you can see that you can find them also. I'm not. This is a link where you can easily find the music from the Tang period people. So perhaps a later speaker, I understand there will be a speaker talking about Tang Dynasty music. Perhaps he or she will also be discussing about this. But the fact that it's important because it's associated with Northwest China, and also the discovery of the notation from Dunhuang also make it a significant part of the staging of expressive arts, right? So obviously, this has been go on for a long period of time, including the incorporation of musician or musical creativities with modern troupes like the Silk Road performance, and so I'm not going into the technical detail about this. You can read perhaps on your own if you're interested in this matter. I did talk about, so I will try to move on a little bit more further from here. But as you can see, I want to show you, here are the collection of the select dance images that would be used for recreating, restaging the dance movements inspired, as I mentioned before, mostly, as you can see, from Tang Dynasty and perhaps a little bit earlier, Pure Land, or so many of them are. So obviously, these ones all have the sort of religious art context as they are performing in front of the deities, the Buddhas, and so at the setting is very similar and comparable to believed to be the Tang court arrangements, right? The sitting of the musicians on the sides, and etc. Those of you who have visited Dunhuang will probably already learn much about this. So I also talk about this and by giving examples in my book, so you can feel free to explore on your own. And obviously, the maps, different maps shows you, and we don't have time, but the Getty Institute, the excellent exhibitions as well as video clips that showcasing the landscape of Dunhuang. So I will also skip this. The idea is that the Dunhuang expressive arts are becoming sort of a poetic, the argument is that it has become sort of a poetic representation in the Chinese cultural imaginations. That has long been a symbol of the frontier, right? As you can see from the performance and of interactions with the foreign, approaching it as a constellation of contemporary meanings and relations that come into existence through the activities of the different performers and other social and actors in live performances. You can view it as a collection of static historical objects to a field of contemporary cultural productions in which artists and scholars, as well as performers and audience and you, collaboratively construct and project new visions of a multicultural China into both the domestic as well as international media and performance sphere. So the performative processes that I talk much about in my book of creating this Chinascape embodied in the Dunhuang expressive art provides insight into China's changing approach to manifesting the idea of Tianxia by restaging its sort of Tang cosmopolitan, mostly Tang, but you see now actually moving into Song. That is something that I also mentioned in my book. There is the change. Whereas in the Dunhuang grottos, you will find the different caves being constructed during different dynastic periods, depicting the stylistic as well as spatial arrangement that makes each one of them distinct. You also see this transformation on the staging of contents and styles of contemporary dances and performance inspired not only by the Dunhuang arts, but also by the Silk Road as a general theme. So those are some of the things that I also talk about in my book. And in addition to the actual staging of dance performances, there is also the argument about the exhibitions in various forms, such as museum exhibitions or other form of reconstructing the caves. And they also travel around the globe in order to help the audience understand this long historical cultural interaction that has continued in a way today, but also now as being framed in my book being sort of under the theoretical implication of the traditional Chinese vision of world order. So I think I would just show you the rest of the PowerPoint slides rather than continue talking. In Tianxia, there are some different variations. As you can see, it also made a huge progression. The idea of Tianxia being interpreted by different scholars over the years since 2007 and earlier, right? When you resurface as a major key term in the sort of international relations field of studies, but also I am trying to bring it into the idea of the cultural anthropology, ethnographic study, and the art fields. So all this comes together. Yes, so some of the interesting idea is the different approach in trying to interpret, recontextualize the idea of Tianxia, right? The ones that I provide in my book is how it's being perceived as sort of an artistic form, right, in relation to national and cultural policies. But obviously, the more traditional format is approaching analyzing it from a historical interpretation kind of view and trying to translate it into our modern day rhetoric and how that would have an impact on the conversation with different scholars in the field, and eventually leading to perhaps greater impacts in my case, the expressive arts or museum exhibitions or films and other things. So I would appreciate that if you perhaps have the opportunity, check your library, or you can look at the different chapters that I put into the field. And and I did some being in the field sort of discussion, philosophical discussion about representation and how that come into being, not only in a stage performance sense, but also through the lenses, as I showed you before, how the filming of it, how the institutionalized of things would change the nature as well as the stylistic choices of the performing arts. So this is a beautiful sort of photo of Dunhuang. In its springtime, it's covered in snow. It's early spring. It's those of you who are interested in literary reviews and studies, or ethnomusicology, I do discuss the idea of soundscape in my book, through analytical study of Tang poetry and lyrics, obviously some of them. And some of the case study would draw on the so-called 民族舞剧, right? So the idea about debating whether it's a classical dance genre versus like a folk traditional dance genre, that also falls under how that would exemplify or inspire, perhaps, or draw similarity or differences when you compare them to the categorization and implementations of Tang Dynasty or earlier forms of music that has been traveling along the Silk Road and arrived in China, right? So, and obviously, going back to the idea about institutionalization, that would have something to do with how it is being perceived and represented on stage. Here are just some of the materials that is associated with the staging processes that I don't have time to show you, but you are welcome. And also when talking about the Tang Dynasty frontier poetries, I draw the differences between the stylistic masculine versus the very feminine in the South, right, where we will witness it more in terms of the Song Dynasty, which and now is becoming also, I would say it's not a simultaneously rising form of ideas, but I would say it's a logical phenomenon that follows suit with the rise of the idea of Tianxia worldview as well. There's a focus on the celebration of the Song and not only the Tang, but there's a celebration of the very southern land, Jiangnan kind of idea. So you're welcome to contact me if you're interested in further discussions. So this would be the last slide for today's talk, because I don't have time. This is apology letter also discovered in Dunhuang for getting drunk. We are not drinking, but I thought this is also very interesting because it associates with the cultural phenomenon of banquets, how popular banquets, and that to the point that there would be a form like a model that you can write apology letters for getting drunk at banquets. And the banquet music that also emerged during the time will have much inspiration on the development of what we see today as the Dunhuang dances. I think I should conclude here before I keep everyone for any longer time. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for the Town Center.
I just wanted to thank you for such a compelling topic and also engaging talk. And I'm also glad that you've given us new ways to conceptualize both performance and world order for kind of bringing together the past and the present, which is always very interesting. Also, as an, practicing archaeologist, you study the past, but then it's also sort of brought into the present, and viewers and communities relate to it in many different ways. And it's also, of course, used. The idea of a usable past is also very interesting in context of your lecture. I want to invite our audience if you have any questions, so please type them into the Q&A box. In the meantime, I have a few questions that I sort of was thinking about. And one thing I was thinking about, when you emphasize sort of Tianxia as a performance or a spectacle, could you talk a little bit more about how performance produces then specifically political legitimacy? I'm wondering, how do you use performance in that? How do you craft it in that way? Whether it's in the past or the present.
Yes, thank you very much for that question, because that seems to be also part of the theme of the book in a way, right? How it's related to this worldview. But it's interesting to start with the idea of Tianxia, whereas it's not entirely just political, but also very cultural. So in that sense, when you are staging, I would say that either successfully or unsuccessfully, either successfully or unsuccessfully, there's the attempt of trying to represent a historical past that is multifaceted and diverse and cosmopolitan, as a way of manifesting in ways of suggesting the possibility of continuing in that pattern, rather than, I did not have the opportunity to talk about the dance dramas, but the dance dramas are the ones, as you can see perhaps, that I was showing some of the posters. Those are in the forms of narrative in the plots where all the different dance movement from different groups will be incorporated into perhaps one theme, or in the different instruments will be used, or the different characters will be built in order to stage the interaction of the idea of all welcome, all open, and there's a possible negotiation that leads to the end and prosperous sharing of a community. I think that is often seen. Not all the program does this, but it is especially significant when we are looking at expressive art programs in relation to the Silk Road and from modern day China, since the time of Siluhuayu, the ring of flowers on Silk Road. But obviously there is much change into the individual programs, obviously, how it is being embodied by individual dancers, not necessarily like a longer, dance drama. But Dunhuang is unique in the sense that the choreographers was able to a certain extent, I'm not judging to say that it's more successful or not, to create a genre that is quite uniquely able to reflect the cultural interactions from that specific region and certain extent amount of time. And that is immediately recognizable, not only to be only Chinese, like the general conceptual that it's a Chinese classical dance, but also hinting on many elements that is from many elements that is all under heaven in a way, but in an embodied way. So at the same time, coming from archaeological point of view, it's sort of a living on this idea rather than just a symbolic, static symbol telling you that this is what, but rather than, I talk about the linguistic philosophy of how that will also play into the movement and the direction of the dancers when they are in training. So I don't know if that addresses your question or
Yeah, it's just a very interesting sort of.
It is. It all goes into details about like breathing exercise but all those are also related to specific ways of looking at movements and how we discuss movements. So,
but it's also, yeah, it's just interesting to think about what counts as evidence of staging, right? I mean, what do you, what does, you know, then you're stuck sort of in the canvas that is Dunhuang is to kind of figure out, you know, are we really, we're talking about ritual events, right? I mean, those are the ones that are then perhaps, or is it everyday life scenes? How do you kind of, I would say extrapolate, but how do you sort of decide then, you know, what in the past, what are sort of staging moments and what are just, I wouldn't say this, but you get my question. I mean, I
kind of do.
From the present, I can see it. You know, I can see what might count. Sort of, you know, in terms of global vision or internationalism, but I'm trying to also locate it in the past.
In the past, yes. So I did talk, as I mentioned before, there's the soundscape where I use Tang poetries in also analyze of, especially talking about the musical suites. That is a they use the word collect during the Tang, where they will be either sent by, you know, groups of envoys that bring a whole group of musicians that eventually become a formalized part during celebration of either the battle winning or recognitions, you know. So those are recorded in the Tang, you know, the New Book of Tang, etc. So those are very interesting in looking at how that has been part of the past, but now it's less so in terms of trying to advocate in terms of, but now it's focusing on more representing the past, but already being embodied in the details in the living performance, rather than, this is why it's so interesting, because you are no longer looking at static text telling you this is when certain group of performance from Kazakhstan from past, but nowadays what you see would be the incorporation perhaps of musical instruments and performing in a staging process that is perhaps not entirely related to the narrative of the dance drama or the narrative of the program, the musical program. Or, as I mentioned in the later chapters of my book, the invitation of foreign musicians and dancers in collaborating into production in China also brings interesting perspective in understanding how this cultural idea of Tianxia rather than a political rhetoric is trying to sort of represent itself in a way. I don't know if that is helpful in understanding. Yeah. So once again, some are more successful than the other ones.
Sure.
It's to which extent that the scholars would want to recognize it or not, you know. Some are more obvious, some are more creative, I would just say. Yeah.
Thank you. There are a few questions online, so Frank, maybe we can start with those. I think I can read them.
I'm happy to read them. So first question is, what is the Dunhuang Academy's name and or catalog number for the Mona Lisa of the East painting, if you know that? And then the second question within that is, what is the original Chinese ancient historical name in Chinese for what is now described or named as the Silk Road?
Wait, what's the second one? I'm sorry about that.
With the original Chinese name, historical name,
of
what is now described as the Silk Road?
丝绸之路. Is that a question? Am I?
Yeah, I guess that's what they want to know.
If I understand correctly, they want the Chinese name.
Yeah, so it was the same as now, right? Is that what you're? Yeah, I guess they wanted to know at the time.
Oh, that's. Well, I think that this is a question for you and for Sandra because of the study of the Dunhuang Center. But obviously, we all know that the the name came much later in a way.
Yeah, I don't think it exists in any ancient texts.
Yeah.
So it is a construct. It's a modern construct.
Yeah.
It is 17th century, I believe, or more or less, right? Yeah. The idea about 19. Yes. So, but then again, like I mentioned during the lecture, that there would be arguably the Alexandrian Great, when there's the expansion, there's already like forging ahead. There's a connection that's been made, contact been made, that eventually will lead to the more structuralized like trade routes and other forms. And I believe, if I remember correctly, K45, if I could be, I don't want to like, yes, K45, Tang. for the painting, that the question about that one.
Okay. Another question.
And interestingly, I let me put it this way. This is so interesting because remember that they usually, this one, the one that on the, are you still seeing slides or are you seeing me?
Slides.
Oh, okay. So you see the one that is standing on the slide here. Mm-hmm. There would be another one that is on the other side of the space. So there are times you will find several of them, depending on which one you're looking at. So I just want to point that out. There's like not just one of them, but that's another thing about the Dunhuang mural paintings, is that there will be scholarly research on the development of patterned, the so-called 白描. So they develop this technique of copying these, not necessarily this one, but you see similar pre-arranged like trays of paintings techniques that helps to recreate very similar images in the caves, because there are so many of them. Other questions? Thank you.
Yeah, the Dunhuang collection expresses a strong influence of Buddhism. Was pre-Buddhism culture different, and how?
Oh, pre-Buddhism cultural. The one, I think the question would be like, how many different, it is predominantly Buddhist image that you find in Dunhuang, but as Buddhism transmitted further, away from its origin in South Asia, and it obviously would have changed in terms of we are talking about the Dunhuang arts and the cave paintings. So what you will see is the change of the stylistic choices of as well as the costumes and the content selections, which one will be more prominent during depending on the cave, when the cave is constructed. And there will be some caves that are constructed to reveal like Tibetan Buddhism and etc., but very few of them. So you do find this like tantric Buddhism also exists in the Dunhuang caves, but not many of them. So it is, I guess that is a question needs to be specified and then comparing like specific caves on how each one of them is. Probably a spatial arrangements differently. Some later ones would have perhaps secular alongside in the murals, stories next to the religious one, and that also tells you, the change of acceptance in a way, or the parallel acceptance of Buddhism in the regions, or etc. But we all know that when you travel, it's localized. So you do see, depending on also depending on the painters that was helped construct the caves, there would be studies on an argument based on the technique of the painting that the painters would travel from central, more southern region of China further down to northwest, and therefore you see the stylistic and technique change in portraying the Buddhist art that you see in Dunhuang. In terms of expressive arts, like I think I mentioned before, that you predominantly from the Tang and maybe some Weijin styles, depending on. It's interesting, especially when you're comparing to the masculine depiction of the Buddhist art. versus the female dancers. There's the male dancers. There's increasing attention paying to the male dancers. I'm talking about the contemporary staging of the Buddhist art from Dunhuang. But that also reveals the number of selected images that is used for staging the type of Buddhist art that you witness in Dunhuang. I don't know if, once again, I think that is the best I could address now. Yeah.
Another question. I wonder to what extent modern productions that claim to draw inspiration from Dunhuang art are grounded in academic research, as opposed to being shaped by their own romanticized or imaginative visions of Dunhuang. Perhaps that act of romanticization constitutes the staging moment itself?
Definitely. As we are now discussing about this topic, I would, to a certain extent, that a romanticized version is being sort of discursively produced in a way that the way that we are talking about Dunhuang, whether am I following along the question correctly? Is that the question? Like how scholars might be romanticizing? Yeah, is absolutely, because the grand dream of Dunhuang, the dance drama I showed, they are based on love stories that is, definitely romanticized to a large extent. But in terms of scholarly, I don't want to say all academics are romantics. I don't, one would disagree with me, but yes, I would say that there are moments which is more apparent, this sort of discursive formation of an image of Dunhuang that we want to visualize as a part of something, of a culture, or of a cosmopolitan past, or a rich, multifaceted history that we all aspire to. Would be part of the imagination of contemporary Dunhuang scholarship, I would say for sure. But of course, not all of them are as pleasant just focusing on the music and dance. There will be plenty of talking about other legal stuff, legal documents, and property documents.
Is the concept of Tianxia influenced by Confucian philosophy?
Partially, but you also find them in Taoist teaching as well. So, yeah.
Okay, and then one more question, I think, before maybe we wrap up.
Thank you.
Could the recent shift or broadening of modern productions focus to the Song dynasty reflect a growing awareness that the Tang culture, especially in the area around Dunhuang, was less purely Chinese and thus less effective as a vehicle for representing the Chinese Tianxia?
Oh, wow. Is there like that's a very good question. Yes, I think that, I think there is a tendency to see the parallel rather than just focusing on one or another. But understanding the Dunhuang has also, the frontier region has always been a very contested region, regardless of what topic that we're talking about. So there is, while we celebrate the multifaceted, cosmopolitanism itself has, as I mentioned to my other peers, that it has received criticisms in terms of what are you exactly the different versions of ideas of cosmopolitanism would also be debatable depending on who you're talking to. So the rise of the Song dynasty, right, as we witness in the later like Yulinku, right, as we move on other locations surrounding Dunhuang, not only in Dunhuang, more Gaoku, you're not only witnessing the parallel thrive or the highlight or focus of a different aesthetic, which is politicalized genre, definitely speaks to the possibility of awareness of I don't want to use the word nationalism, but the idea is part of the national history of celebrating not only the multifaceted, but there's also a very consolidated and needs to be recognized, right? Central sort of type of aesthetic that is represented by the Song right after after the fall of Tang, for reasons that also is debatable.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's, I feel like I'm not adequately answering all the questions, but I do the best I could, I guess.
Yeah, I think, the last sort of open question, it wasn't a question, it's just thanking you for the richly illustrated presentation, and I second that. So on behalf of all of us, thank you for this insightful and intellectually stimulating lecture, and we really appreciate the generosity of your time and your expertise. And of course, we look forward to continuing the discussion. And for anybody interested in this particular topic, past, present, performance, aesthetics, nation building, I highly recommend the book. And one of the things that we are sort of planning for that October 2026 conference on Tang music is exactly that, is how the Tang Dynasty performative aspects, also kind of, continue to resonate in the present. So,
for sure, yes.
For the next year,
years to come, I would say.
Yeah.
But yes. Celebration of the multifaceted and rich, yes.
Yeah, I think, and that is very a very interesting topic. So we look forward to continuing that discussion also next year. And in the meantime, we look forward to touching base with you again. And thank you so much for this. And I hope you have, and all of you listening online, a nice weekend. And until next time.
Until next time, thank you very much for everything. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.